What are you doing?
Just catching up on some grading. Hey, I'm Professor Cade. Today we're going to be talking about punctuation with quotation marks. Now let me just say from the beginning, we are not looking at punctuation with citations. So if you're writing an MLA or APA paper or something like that, that's not going to be covered in this. It's a different beast entirely, and I'm going to hit that in a different lesson. So this can be kind of a tricky topic for people because American English doesn't really have a good one-size-fits-all rule for this, but I've created a usually rule that'll get us to the right place about 95% of the time. And luckily, my usually rule is extremely easy to remember. All right, so here it is. Punctuation inside the quotes. That's not how Wikipedia does it. Yeah, we're gonna talk about that too. Okay, but before we do that, let's head down to the page for some examples. A famous grammar historian once said, "The Society of Grammar and Grammarish Things kicked me out for using a semicolon as a winky face. They called it poor decorum." How dare they? Okay, now before we get into it, I just want to point out this comma right here and say we are not going to be talking about that one, okay? That's another beast of its own and a different video. What we are looking at is the end of the quote, okay? So we know we need a period. We just need to figure out, does the period come before or after the quotation mark, okay? So, what do you think? How am I supposed to know? I mean, I just gave you the usually rule. That should be enough to get you started. Can you DM it to me? Stupid phones. Tiny Cade, will you help us out?
Punctuation inside the quotes.
You can always count on Tiny Cade. Punctuation inside the quote. Period, quotation mark. Now, as I'm wont to do, I started us out with an easier example, so let's take a look at another one that might be a little bit trickier. Okay, so the SGGT booted a famous grammar historian for poor decorum.
It was one winky face. Can we please move on with our lives?
Alright, now, there are two different ways that we could look at this quote. We could think of it as a direct quote, as if we're actually pulling the literal words that somebody said, or we can think about it as what's known as a scare quote, okay? And all a scare quote means is it's essentially highlighting that information, drawing special attention to it, okay? And often it's done with sort of a tinge of irony. If you feel yourself wanting to use air quotes or raise your eyebrows or kind of add a sarcastic tone, it's a good chance you're dealing with scare quotes. Now, I'm not sure why they call them scare quotes, but I do have one theory. Hey, grades are posted. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's it. But back to the sentence. What do we do with this scare quote? Now, again, this is the one that I see mistaken most often, okay? Since we don't have a complete sentence in here, people are tempted to put that period on the outside of the quote. But our usually rule, punctuation inside the quotes, works here too, okay? So once again, period, quote. So it doesn't matter whether this is a direct quote or a scare quote. Either way, the period goes inside the quotation mark. All right, let's look at another example. Okay, so a famous grammar historian claims that his semicolon winky face was an accident, but the SGGT didn't buy it.
One winky face.
Okay, so what we should notice in this sentence is we have but. Okay, this is one of our fanboys, and we're not going to go too deep into it right now, but we have an independent clause after it, independent clause before it. That means that we need a comma with this fanboys. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, take a look at my fanboys video and then come on back here. Now, after the billions of essays I've graded and billions of articles I've edited, I would say about 80% of the time, I would see the comma on the outside of the quotation marks here. But let's bring Tiny Cade back in here to remind us of our usually rule.
Punctuation inside the quotes.
Punctuation inside the quotes, okay? That applies here as well. Now I'm gonna pause briefly here and make sure to mention that I am strictly talking about American English with the way these rules are done, okay? British English follows a different system of punctuating with quotation marks, okay? And Wikipedia tends to follow the British version more than the American version, which I'm convinced is why most students are confused about how to punctuate this. And honestly, the British version makes a little bit more sense than the American one does, but that's above my pay grade. Okay, so let's come back to the page and shake things up a little bit. We're gonna go back to our last sentence. So before we had the SGGT booted a famous grammar historian for poor decorum, okay? We're gonna tweak it just a little bit. Did you hear that the SGGT booted a famous grammar historian for poor decorum?
Can we please move on with our lives?
So now all we've done, we have the same structure sentence that we had last time with this, but we have changed it to a question mark, okay? My dog is snoring. This is the moment that our usually rule fails us, okay? So when we're dealing with a question mark with quotation marks, we have to ask ourselves, is the question contained within the quotation, or is the question happening in our sentence outside of the quotation? Okay? In this case, the question is happening in our sentence, outside of the quote. When that is the case, the question mark goes on the outside of the quotation mark. Another quick example. Okay, a famous grammar historian once asked, why would they revoke my membership for a single winky face? Okay, so going back to our rule, is the question happening in the quote or is it happening in our sentence? Well, in this case, it's happening in the quote. When that happens, the question mark goes inside the quote. Okay, just for fun, we are gonna look at an extremely rare case of some of the strangest looking punctuation that you've seen. Did you hear that a famous grammar historian once asked, why would they revoke my membership for a single winky face? Okay, so in this case, we have a question happening inside of our quote, and we have a question happening outside of our quote. Our sentence is a question, and the quote is a question. In this super rare case, this is what it would look like. Question mark inside the quote, question mark outside the quote. That crazy looking thing is correct. Now, just because it's correct doesn't mean that you should use it. If you ever wind up with a sentence like this, for the love of God, just rewrite it. Now, we're gonna rewrite one of our sentences for our final example. What if, for whatever reason, we didn't want to use the fanboys and we wanted to use a conjunctive adverb instead? Okay, so let's see what happens there. Okay, so a famous grammar historian claims that his semicolon winky face was an accident. However, the SGGT didn't buy it. Okay, so first thing, make sure you get that comma after however. Now, since however is not a fanboys conjunction, it's a conjunctive adverb, it's punctuated differently. If you're not sure what I'm talking about there, go check out my video on semicolon. So we need a semicolon to separate these clauses. The semicolon is one of our 5% exceptions. Okay, so in this case, your semicolon goes outside the quote. Okay, the same would be true for a colon. Now, we've seen that the commas and periods always go inside the quotes. Question marks can go either way, semicolons outside of the quotes. There are some very rare situational exceptions among all of those. So, let's go back to our usually rule.
Punctuation inside the quotes.
Punctuation inside the quotes. Now, we've seen from these examples that sometimes you're gonna be wrong. If you follow that rule all the time, it's not always gonna get you there. But what I've seen in all of my grading and editing is that 70% of the time, this is done incorrectly. If you move to that usually rule, you're gonna get it right 95% of the time, okay? Now, I'm a big believer in not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And going from 30% to 95% is a huge improvement, and I'm willing to take it. And that's it. Punctuation with quotation marks. You're now an expert. So if you learned something, do me a favor and hit the like button. And if you like the way that I teach and think you might be able to learn more from me, hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss my weekly uploads. What have you done? Give me my mustache back. Okay. got Daddy's paper?